I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's Hammer Forum on global warming with Cleo, Paskal, and Jeff Biggers, and moderated by Ian Masters. The Hammer Forum is a series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with the very generous support of Andy and Branya Galef. Our moderator tonight is Ian Masters. He's going to introduce our guests. Ian's a BBC-trained broadcast journalist who's covered national security affairs for over 25 years on public radio. He's the host of Background Briefing, which can be heard Sundays from 11 a.m., and now the Daily Briefing, which is Mondays through Thursdays at 5 p.m. on KPFK 90.7 FM. Ian has been a senior fellow at UCLA Center for Strategic and International Affairs and the UCLA Center for International Relations, and he was a consultant to the Center for National Security Studies at Los Alamos Laboratory. Please join me in welcoming Ian Masters.
Thank you, Claudia, and all of you non-deniers for coming here tonight to learn about the causes and consequences of global warming. Not to have you paralyzed by despair at the fate of the planet, but to have you armed with the information you need to save the world. Jeff Biggers will begin with a 15-minute talk on an industry that touts itself with the oxymoron clean coal, an even more cynical notion than safe cigarettes, if you consider that while the Obama administration pumped $3.4 billion of stimulus money into the pursuit of the chimera of clean coal, at best 15 to 20 years away, the industry that is the largest single source of climate-changing gases has invested 10 times that, $35 billion, in old, dirty plants with 16 large plants fired up since 2008 and 16 more under construction. They will generate 125 million tons of greenhouse gases annually, the equivalent of putting 22 million more cars on the road. It is also worth noting that nobody has died from a solar panel. But a lot of miners have died extracting coal. And an area the size of Delaware in Appalachia has also died from mountaintop removal, perhaps the most aggressive insult to nature that man has devised in the pursuit of civilization, except perhaps for offshore drilling. Then, if you are not warmed up enough, Cleo Paskal will speak for about 15 minutes on the global geopolitical, economic, and human consequences of this man-made assault on the biosphere that is in plain sight, with floods in Pakistan, fires in Russia, and large chunks of Greenland falling into the ocean. As the Arctic warms twice as fast as the rest of the planet and sea ice melts at a record pace, 2010 is poised to be the warmest year on record. Paradoxically, though, as the evidence mounts, the denial grows. In part fueled by bilious billionaires like the Koch brothers, the third richest Americans after Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, who are the largest funders of global warming denial and major benefactors behind the AstroTurf Tea Party movement. This disconnect between Mother Nature writhing on her sickbed and business as usual in the name of jobs, jobs, jobs is indeed puzzling. In part, it can be ascribed to our binary media trapped in the notion that in the universe of discourse there are only two equal and opposite opinions. Fox News calls it balance. But it has enabled creationism to be equated with evolution and has allowed delayers and deniers of global warming to scour academia for shills for big business to argue the other side of nothing. It could be that we suffer from what Tad Homer Dixon wrote in an op-ed in Monday's New York Times, protective cognition, a fear of losing our mastery over nature, a fear that coal and oil companies are exploiting. Then after Cleo has you boiling mad, by the way, she's just flown in from Tonga, an island in the middle of the Pacific that is being inundated by the rising sea level from the melting polar ice caps. We will have a discussion on stage before an extensive Q&A from all of you endangered earthlings. Just in closing, the other disconnect is, of course, how thoroughly gridlocked political progress is on global efforts to deal with this life-threatening issue. With the US the most recalcitrant in terms of joining a regime to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we have come up with a cap-and-trade scheme that will reward Wall Street, those same banksters who have succeeded in blowing America's hegemonic advantage as the world's economic powerhouse. Let's face it, who would want to risk their money to emulate our economy? But conversely, the country most dedicated to implementing the Kyoto protocols and reducing global greenhouse gases is Germany, and their economy is doing better than ever. Meanwhile, the planet melts, and if you have ever got into a black car on a sunny day, you know what hot means. Well, the white car we have been in for millennia, white like the poles that reflect the sun back into space, is turning black. And in the planet's history, there have been 5 mass extinctions. 4 of them were caused by climate change. It's up to you and us and all of us to prevent a 6th. Let me introduce Jeff Biggers. He's a journalist, author, and community organizer. He has worked with both George McGovern and William Sloane Coffin and co-founded the Interfaith Assembly on Housing and Homelessness. He is also the grandson of coal miners, and his books, The United States of Appalachia, How Southern Mountaineers Brought Independence, Culture, and Enlightenment to America, and In the Sierra Madre, built on his appreciation of mountain people. He has become increasingly active in working against mountaintop removal and other ravages of the coal industry, evidenced in his latest book, Reckoning at Eagle Creek, The Secret Legacy of Coal in the Heartland. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Biggers.
I actually, Ian, dislocated my shoulder putting up a solar panel once. So they're very dangerous, but I also got struck by lightning, and Ian thinks I'm only going to speak for 15 minutes. He doesn't know that he's invited the son of a Southern preacher and a community activist to Los Angeles to talk about coal, something we're very familiar with. And so as I was driving here today on Highway 405, the traffic was so bad I couldn't believe I had to be here during rush hour. And so I did what you do when you have a GPS. I just closed my eyes and started to drive. And I tried to imagine myself in some other place other than Highway 405. And I put myself in the Bryce National Park in Utah. And there, for the first time, I realized it was 2020 in the future. And before me, I couldn't believe it, just wafting in front of me were all these clouds. It was 67 million tons of CO2 going in a good place, not a bad place. And there were 18 billion gallons of water just floating into the sky. And I realized it was the cost of coal for driving on this highway, for using this microphone, that 44% of the electricity coming out of this glorious city where your sun shines 368 days of the year goes to dirty coal, back to Utah, back to Dineta on the Navajo Nation at Four Corners in Arizona, back now where last week, with their great wisdom, they have decided to open a strip mine just 2 whoops and a holler from our beloved Bryce National Park to feed this microphone. And so I opened my eyes back up and threw my GPS out of the car and wondered, why am I using electricity at the Hammer Forum from coal-fired plant? Why did my granddaddy have to dig up coal? Why are we digging up coal today? And I realized it goes back to 1895. And I remember it well. I wasn't born then, but I remember it. It was right there in Chicago. And of course, 2 years before, it's this Englishman. It's always an Englishman who causes the problems in the United States. This man named Samuel Insull had lit up America with his electricity. And everyone wanted to come to see Chicago at the World's Fair because we had the first coal-fired plants and the electricity was lighting up. And there's a young liberal Democrats, because it's always the young liberal Democrats giving us problems. And his name was Mr. Peabody. And he had an idea. I can just keep shoveling in the coal for Mr. Insull. And Chicago became the great world's capital of coal. And 1895, I kid you not, Mr. Peabody took out an ad in the Chicago Tribune for smoke-free, clean coal. And then we had problems washing that coal. People were dying. We had more people dying in our coal mines than the front lines of World War I in Europe. And Mr. Peabody said, it's survival of the fittest. But he had a new idea. Clean coal, he said. We can have better workplace safety. In 1831, back in Europe, because it's always the Europeans' problem, we knew in 1831 that by digging up coal and creating coal dust, you could have black lung disease. 1831. And we did nothing about it in the United States until 1969 because of clean coal and the denial of the cost of coal. In 1861, scientists realized that sulfur was coming out of the coal and sulfur dioxide emissions were going into the atmosphere in 1861. And we did nothing about it until 1990 with the Clean Air Act, because a few Yankees and their pine trees up in the north were being affected from acid rain because of clean coal and the denial of the true cost of coal. Today, the majority of Republicans believe global warming, or what I like to call climate destabilization, is a hoax. And the Democrats are just a couple of feet behind them, where a third of the Democrats also have major doubts that global warming is in fact not a hoax, but not true. It's part of our denial, folks. That, think about it, on this stage tonight, during this program, our nation is going to burn 137,000 tons of coal to fuel our nation in 48 states. 250,000 tons of CO2 is going to be going into our atmosphere. Mercury, let's not even begin talking about mercury, which has completely devastated the Midwest where I'm from, will be going into our air. And half of the American populace will live within a half an hour of their watersheds from coal ash piles leaking arsenic and lead. Leaking like in the TVA, the silent tsunami. And as you watch this program tonight, folks, a coal miner will die from black lung disease. 3 coal miners every day die still from black lung disease. Not one media person ever talks about that. We only wait to the tragedy, the coal mine accidents. That 10,000 coal miners died in the last decade from black lung disease. That 104,000 coal miners and immigrants have died in our mines. This human cost of coal that we overlook. And then during this program tonight, I want you to conceptualize that 3 people in America, in the 4 corners, in the Dinétah, the Navajo Nation, in Utah, will die prematurely from heart and lung disease because of your energy in coal-fired plants. And I'm wondering why? Why is this going on today? And I know why. When I was working as a journalist in Mexico during the worst drought in Mexico's history, 1999, where famine had set into the Sierra Madre, and I was living with indigenous people called the Rarámuri, the Tarahumara, looking at people completely living on an agrarian society, I got a letter from my uncle who said, "What the heck are you doing south of the border helping those people when your own heritage has been destroyed?" That an international coal company had come in where my family had lived for 200 years in the back hollers and strip mined us. The same area that gave the coal to Mr. Peabody in 1895. It took them 200 years to catch up with us. That a landmass, as Ian said, the size of Delaware, has been strip mined from Appalachia, 1.5 million acres, the carbon sink of America, the most ancient mountains in the hemisphere, the deciduous forest, erased from a topography through mountaintop removal, the blowing up of our minds. But mountaintop removal is only a tiny percentage of our coal, less than 8% of our production. Strip mining is taking place in 24 states, like Utah, where you get your coal, like Arizona, where you get your coal. That this is a war we're going through right now, a coal field war. That coal has a tremendous cost that we never talk about. And it goes back to that man in 1895 who took out that ad, who began this mythology that when push comes to shove, we can have this microphone here in LA because, well, God damn it, coal is cheap and coal is clean somehow. And we've lived with that mythology for a century and a half. But we've reached the end now. We've reached the tipping point. The denial of black lung, which took the lives of so many Americans. The denial of sulfur dioxide, of course, which led to acid rain and destruction, and still today is admitted, we could live with. But the denial of climate change, as Cleo is going to speak about, is something we can no longer live with. And that is why I'm here to bring the message from the coalfields, from the front lines. You know, I was actually feeling pretty good, Ian, driving down here, believe it or not. Because I love LA. I love the LA highways. I can't believe that there's a young girl sitting right in front of me tonight named Chrissy, who works day and night. And next week we'll have a hearing to make your city probably the most important city in the battle of climate change on the planet. Because you will have an opportunity to decide whether LA will become one of the first coal-dependent cities to become coal-free by 2020. And that will completely change the discussion in the future. That if we can envision a coal-free future, like I did when I closed my eyes there, we can completely envision another world. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jeff. Cleo Paskal specializes in the geopolitical, security, and economic implications of environmental change. She is a fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, London, and a consultant for the United States Department of Energy. Cleo is on the faculty in the Department of Geopolitics at Manipal University, India, and adjunct professor of global change at SCMS in Kochi, India. She briefs a wide range of stakeholders, including the UK Ministry of Defence, the EU, NATO, and the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. Cleo Paskal is also an award-winning writer who has hosted BBC radio shows and wrote an Emmy-winning documentary TV series. She was also a child actress who appeared in the Oscar-nominated and Golden Globe-winning film Lies, My Father Told Me. Her book, Global Warming: How Environmental, Economic, and Political Crises Will Redraw the World Map, was a recipient of the 2010 Award for Special Merit from the Grantham Prize. Ladies and gentlemen, Cleo Paskal.
My credibility was doing okay until the Lies My Father Told Me thing came up. It's a good movie. Do you remember it? Do you remember the girl that showed where babies come from using the live dog? Yes. That's my first scientific exhibition. This scientific exhibition will not be as interesting. Sadly, no live animals will be used. This is not. These are the. I just put out a book. This is not blatant self-promotion. This is, as a Canadian, I'm actually not allowed to do blatant self-promotion. I think that was part of the NAFTA deal, right? We got to keep some of our hockey players. You kept all marketing. But I'm using it to show how the debate around climate change is very different in different countries. The cover on the left, your left, is the American cover. The cover on the right is the Canadian cover. The debate in the US is still heavily focused on very narrow parameters of temperature, those sorts of things, very specific and very limited. The debate in the rest of the world is already going into second order impacts. For example, what might that mean for the Arctic? That's an icebreaker going through the ice in the Arctic, and what that could mean geopolitically. So while the US is getting caught up in this energy usage, carbon trading sort of debate, the rest of the world is already saying, hold on, this is going to have vast geopolitical consequences that we need to deal with at the same time as we're dealing with things like carbon emissions. And I'm going to show you a little bit about that in this presentation, these larger geopolitical implications. Some of you may know this great expression of geography makes history. And you can see that very clearly in the way cities or other sorts of installations are built. These are 4 defensive fortifications built in different locations at different times in different parts of the world, but they're all built essentially the same way. They're built on high ground, so they're easier to defend, more difficult to attack. They're very good defensive installations, but they make an assumption that the environment that was there when they built the installation will remain a constant. And one of the constants that they assume is you'll have a water supply going into the defensive fortification. If you lose your water supply, what had been a good defensive position becomes a death trap. And in many ways, we have done the same thing with all of our infrastructure. We have assumed that the environment which was there when we built it will remain a constant. And already, all around the world, we're starting to see that's not the case. The vast majority of my examples are from the developed world, because there's a lot of focus on the impact on the developing world, and the developing world will have problems. But we will have problems as well, and they're very serious and very critical. These are, for example, there's a landslide in California that took out part of a subdivision, flooding in the UK in 2007, which was extremely destructive. And this is an electrical substation underwater. A lovely railway to nowhere in France lost a lot of its track due to coastal erosion, and a landslide in my home province of Quebec just a few months ago, actually. We're starting to see the impacts already. And some of the things that we're ascribing to climate change, some of the impacts we're ascribing to climate change are much more complex. So when you're looking at, for example, what happened with Katrina in New Orleans, Katrina, when it hit New Orleans, was actually a Category 3 hurricane. In a hurricane zone, every single red line is a hurricane that has hit the US Gulf Coast in the last 150 years. That a hurricane would hit a city in a hurricane zone is not a surprise. So why was there so much damage? Well, one of the reasons was we almost systematically undermined the defenses of that coastline. This is the city as it looked, if you remember. We're coming up to the 5th anniversary, and it was a serious tragedy. We did many things. There was a faulty levee design and implementation, a lack of town planning, large-scale subsidence, which was caused by draining of wetland, extraction of groundwater, inappropriately designed waterways. We weakened the defenses in this already vulnerable area so that a medium-sized hurricane could come in and create massive destruction. We need to deal with climate change. But if we don't deal with these issues as well, we are not secure. We need to broaden out the debate to bring in all of those other factors as well in order to create a more integrated security matrix. There are many ways in which we are, through things like legislation, creating new vulnerabilities. The National Flood Insurance Program is a good example. This is a piece of insane legislation where if private insurers say, look, we're not going to insure you because really you shouldn't be living there, you're going to flood, the federal government can come in and back that insurance. It's one area where the market actually tends to work quite well, but becomes distorted by this federal backing. As a result, you have places like this. This is Dauphin Island. It looks like a sandbar, but they call it an island. It's been hit by hurricanes 6 times since 1979, and the houses on it have been rebuilt 6 times with federal money each time. That's your tax dollars at work. These are mostly second homes, mostly just fancy beachfront property, and so they give, they pay high taxes. It goes into the local coffers. That goes up to the local Congress guy, and then they pass the National Flood Insurance Program year after year after year. This has to stop. along with all of everything we need to do to stop climate change, we need to stop these sorts of things. Otherwise, we are increasingly vulnerable. So the causes of the disruptions that we're seeing include a variety of factors, and they include, but they're not limited to climate change. It's not one problem. This isn't just cutting carbon emissions. It's a million problems, and it's going to require a million solutions. Now, the good thing about that is there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. There are a lot of things we can do very quickly that can make things more secure. And I'm going to go through one of the critical sectors to show you what that might mean. This is first-order impacts. Okay, this is like the cover of my American edition of the book, where we're just looking at what happens at the physical level. And I'm going to go through the energy sector. This is the US Gulf Coast. The little yellow dots are offshore oil and gas platforms. Doesn't include the BP platform. The little black dots onshore are support facilities like refineries and things like that. The two red lines are the tracks of Hurricanes Rita and Katrina as they went through the Gulf Coast in 2005. They did a vast amount of damage. They killed, totally wiped out over 100 platforms. They destroyed 450 pipelines. They created a spike in global oil prices. And this is the other thing. Because the interconnected nature of the global energy system, you knock out one critical component, you lose the whole thing. Or you can affect or destabilize the whole thing. This is one of the offshore platforms jammed under a bridge after Katrina. Gives an idea of the degree. I mean, the humanitarian tragedy that was Katrina is very well understood. The economic implications are less covered. We're starting to see this sort of disruption across many different components of the energy sector. This is a refinery, one of the biggest in Asia. This is Jamnagar in India, was flooded out in 2007. Hydropower is another area that's starting to see disruption. When you build a hydro dam, they do calculations around precipitation levels, river levels, those sorts of things. You look, and to do that, they look at the last 50 to 100 years. Well, the last 50 to 100 years tells us nothing about the next 5 to 10 years. And we're starting to see the impacts already. In India, hydro generation was down over 8% in 2008 and down over 12% in 2009. If they can't get energy from hydro, they're going to have to go into the international marketplace. They're going to have to buy oil, coal, all those other things as well. And apart from affecting the ability to generate, it affects the actual stability of the site, where you can start to see things like dams actually giving way. In Pakistan, they've lost a lot of hydro. And the hydro dams function not only for energy generation, but for irrigation and flood control as well. Nuclear. Now, what I'm about to say about nuclear applies to any thermal plant, including coal. Nuclear plants require an enormous amount of water for cooling. So you either put them on the coast, like you have here in the seismic zone, or you put them on rivers, like they have in France. And the other thing about nuclear plants is they're on a location for minimum 100 years from design to decommissioning, because after their lifetime of use, you have to let them cool before you can move them. Now, you can see a lot of environmental change in 100 years. So if they're on the coast, you're seeing sea level rise, storm surges, those sorts of things. If they're on a river, the river water goes into the plant, cools the plant, and then is discharged back into the river. In France, I'm going to use Celsius because I'm a Canadian. You told us to go metric and you'd follow. We're still waiting. So the water goes into the plant, say, at about 14 degrees. Legally, they can only discharge back into the river at 24 degrees. Now, they've had some very hot summers, so the water is going into the plants at 18, 19, 20 degrees. Very little cooling capacity. In the summer of 2003, they raised the discharge temperature to 30 degrees. You discharge at 30 degrees into a river system, the river system isn't very happy. And still, with that, in 2003, they had to shut down or power down 1/3 of their nuclear facilities. And it cost them about $500 million to buy power from neighboring countries. They present this as a one-off. They always present these things as a one-off. Katrina was a one-off, this one. It happened again in the summer of 2006 and again in the summer of 2009. So when you're talking about a thermal plant, or perhaps nuclear, the first question to ask is, will it actually be able to function? You can look at nuclear waste and all that sort of stuff, but even if you're looking just within the paradigm that's presented to you, this is a cheap energy source, blah, 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 blah. There are in many cases, it just simply won't be able to function. Renewables is another issue. This is solar powered factory, you can't actually see the panels because they built it in a flood zone and the panels are underwater. The basic premise here is, you really need to take into account how environmental change will affect your infrastructure. In summary, in order to truly understand the geopolitical and geoeconomic, we have to understand the geophysical, right? So it's no longer enough just to look at our impact on the environment. We have to look at a changing environment's impact on us. Okay. Now we're going to look very quickly at second order impacts. We've seen how it affects things physically, but then we start to go into kind of legal issues. This is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The basic premise for the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is you get a 200-mile exclusive economic zone off your coastline. That's where your oil and gas, fisheries, all that sort of stuff is. That makes a pretty big assumption that your coastline isn't going to change, right? So if your coastline retreats, does your exclusive economic zone retreat as well? Not covered in international law. In the same way, the physical infrastructure of energy systems has not taken environmental change into account, our legal system has not taken environmental change into account. You get situations, for example, where you have a little island offshore that can deviate your border. Well, what happens if that island disappears? We saw that case very recently in the U.S. Gulf, in the Gulf of Mexico, where Mexico said it had an island well into the Gulf, which would allow it to get oil and gas from deep into the Gulf. And the U.S. government said, okay, fine, show us the island. Mexican Navy went out, couldn't find the island. Mexican Air Force went out, couldn't find the island. Island was gone. So the Mexicans said, obviously the CIA blew up the island. Right. And the U.S. said, fine, but no island, no claim. Now, if that's the new law, no island, no claim, we have a problem. You can see it here in the U.S., again, the U.S. Gulf Coast. This is Florida, that's Cuba. The line in the middle with all the numbers on it, that's the border. It's based on an equidistant principle, equidistant from both coasts. The Cuban coast is fairly mountainous. The U.S. coast that it uses is the Gulf Keys. I don't know if you've been to the Keys, not very mountainous. And if you go up a little bit more, you get to the Everglades. Beautiful swampland. Little bit of sea level rise, operating on the equidistant principle, that middle border would move up just south of Miami. The law is not taking these things into account, and as a result is very problematic. It can become extremely serious in cases like atoll countries. The Maldives come up a lot, and Tuvalu is places that will literally disappear. Well, if they literally disappear, and just to show you, this is the Pacific. Because of the way exclusive economic zones work, you have a little island, you have a lot of water. These are presented as small countries. When you look at the territories they control, they're actually quite substantial. So Kiribati, which has a population of 100,000, has an exclusive economic zone the size of India. If it physically disappears, does it cease to exist as a country? Does it lose its seat in the UN? Do the waters become international waters? Geostrategically, how does the situation reconfigure in that area? In a case, this is the Maldives, is sort of the long, thin chain of island just above the crosshatch section. The crosshatch section is a critical US, UK military base that monitors the Indian Ocean and access into the Persian Gulf. If the Maldives disappears, there's a big question about what will happen to that patch of water, that strategic patch of water. The Indians are saying they'll take in the population potentially and extend their exclusive economic zone, so at least there'll be some control over the area. But again, this is literally uncharted legal waters. You can see all of these factors coming together in the Arctic. In the Arctic, there's a big focus on the ocean and what's happening to the ocean. But on land, we're seeing the permafrost thawing. This is what thawing permafrost does to infrastructure. That was quite a straight railway. That was never a lovely house because it was built in Soviet Union, but it was at least habitable. The infrastructure in the Arctic is undergoing severe stress. And a lot of the infrastructure in the Arctic is critical oil and gas infrastructure. The pipelines that go from Russia into Europe pass over areas of severe permafrost thaw. The black areas are areas at high risk of permafrost thaw by 2050. And a pipeline, electrical transmission line, is only as good as its weakest point. Now, what may happen is you may start to see the Russians doing more shipping rather than pipelining. That gives more flexibility to supply. And if you look at this view, this is a view from the Arctic, from the North Pole, you can see that if you're, for example, China, which has resource issues, you would much prefer Russia to be delivering by ship than to be delivering by pipeline, because you can get into the Arctic through the Northwest Passage, the melting Northwest Passage, or the Northeast Passage over Russia a lot more easily because the ice is disappearing, and you can get access to that supply relatively easily. The Russians can now could then, in that situation, cut off Europe, but not lose the revenue stream because they would be supplying, for example, China. Whole new situation developing. China, which has resource problems, it understands this and has been targeting new population groups to create alliances with, including Canadian Aboriginals. Canadian Aboriginals, there's a big delegation of Canadian Aboriginal leaders that went to Beijing in 2008. And this is a quote from that expedition. One of the major chiefs said, Canadian Aboriginals own or control about a third of the Canadian landmass, which is accurate through land claim settlements. And they went to tell Beijing that Aboriginal Canada was open for business. The chief also told Chinese political and business leaders the biggest source for uncertainty for developing natural resources in Canada is Aboriginal land claims. If Aboriginal people are your partners, that uncertainty disappears. And another chief said that the trip was an important step for us in moving forward. Our future is not only in Canada, but in partnering with other countries. So you're getting a situation here where, because the Arctic is thawing, because of the way energy infrastructure is shifting, because China is much more aware and actively involved in securing resources over the long term, you get new sorts of partnerships that may undermine existing security alliances and open up new fault lines socially, politically, and economically. This is not a thermometer against a black sky. This is a very complicated, integrated situation that is extremely problematic, and many other countries have a much better understanding of it than we do. So geography makes history, but now environmental change is remaking geography. Thank you.
Let me think for a minute here, Cleo. Let me ask Jeff to clarify that what you said to somebody here in the audience is working on a proposal to make LA a coal-independent city and to kick the habit. And I can see that it would be an important precedent, just as California has led the country in reducing emissions from cars. Give us an idea of the politics of it, because we had a forum with Dave Freeman, who was up until recently the head of the DWP. He tried to build a huge solar plant in the Owens Valley, which DWP owns the land going back to the movie Chinatown. But Antonio, the mayor, and he had an argument over the DWP's money, and Dave lost, and we all lost. But tell me about this.
Well, the actual sort of scuttlebutt on the politics of Los Angeles, I can't really discuss.
No, I mean about
that's
the
top secret stuff. But
Right.
what we do know, of course, is we are in the midst of these hearings with the Water and Power Department. And in your neck of the woods here, I believe the next hearing is going to be September 13th coming up. What it is the City Council is considering 6 proposals, 2 of which actually would get your city off coal by 2020 and shifting over to either renewables or non-coal resources. At the same time, there's a tremendous amount of funds that would be set up to create at least 18,000 jobs, if not more, in the clean energy sector. There would be a huge investment and huge tax incentives for a massive program for solar panels and other, I think the big issue now too is just energy efficiency. And saving energy here in Los Angeles. So I think it's the big issue, which I think folks like Chrissy, who's with the Sierra Club, will be able to discuss, and she is passing around material, is how to get the city council to come on board with the mayor to take this very radical step for America. Because think about it, here I am living in Illinois, in a state controlled by liberal Democrats, where the majority of our energy comes from dirty coal and always has been, and we are plowing billions of dollars into new research in a coal revival program. And it's something that boggles our mind is the geography of politics, just like the politics of coal, transcends political parties. And so if a city like Los Angeles is able to send a message to the rest of the country that we can envision a city operating on renewables, or at least on non-coal or non-fossil fuels, then we have a possibility to move that in different parts of the country. And I think that's the kind of incredible step. You know, I hate to use the metaphor of an earthquake in this kind of area here, but it would be a real energy earthquake in terms of the rest of the country realizing it is possible, because I think that's what's holding us back right now, is this kind of antiquated idea. You know, all of us remember Jimmy Carter lagging, you know, that poor guy had to lug that solar panel up on the White House, and we feel like it was just a symbolic effort, that there hasn't been any breakthroughs since then. And think about it, Ian. Last year, during the recession, with just a sprinkling of stimulus funds, we increased wind power in America by 39%. You know, and we're not going to replace coal tomorrow. Coal provides 42 to 45% of our energy across the country. But we have to set a roadmap to say by 2020 or 2030, we're going to get ourselves off this addiction of coal and begin removing to other renewables. And there's this whole smorgasbord of options. And LA really can be a leader in that.
So, Cleo, so many of the scenarios, and maybe I'm informed by these big Hollywood movies, that global warming would happen quickly, particularly if the ice shelves in Antarctica and Greenland just slid off and plopped into the water like a giant ice cube. It would rise very quickly. And much of your presentations still felt like there was a kind of rational basis of countries operating. And I'm not sure how drastic it's going to be, with huge amounts of the earth going underwater very quickly. The refugee problems. I mean, I have a feeling that people will be scrambling for high grounds and shooting each other over a can of tuna.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. I deliberately use quite conservative scenarios or quite conservative climate predictions in order to figure out what we know will definitely happen. That may happen. This is happening. So let's at least start to deal with these things, and maybe we'll be in a more secure position as the destabilization comes. And in fact, climate destabilization is a very good term for it, or general environmental destabilization. We in the West are very far behind on securing our position. So if you look at China, for example, the one-child policy, which was implemented 30 years ago, is essentially an environmental policy. They took a look at their resources and they said, we don't have the resources to increase our population. That is a very difficult decision for any country to make. And in fact, as an individual in the government to make, to say they're going to limit the number of family members they can have. If they made that decision domestically in order to reduce demand, you can only imagine what they've done since then to secure supply. And you can see it. They're Chinese-owned and operated farms in Africa, in Asia. There are increasingly linkages in Latin America. That's all about increasing their resilience in times of resource scarcity. And a large part of that resource scarcity is going to be caused by environmental change.
But the resources themselves exacerbate environmental change, particularly coal.
Yeah.
And oil.
Yeah. I mean, but if you look at new technologies, new energy technologies, China has come from nowhere to being a leader in solar in 5 years, because they want to get off fossil fuels. I mean, they have a problem, it's cheap, and they have coal, and so they're going to use it. But at the same time, everybody's looking for cheap renewable energy. And places like India and China that don't have a large indigenous oil and gas lobby are looking for them much more aggressively than we are, because they don't have those legislative blockages along the way. They're not fighting Koch brothers, for example. Mm-hmm. They want to get it done for straight up national security reasons. So if you're going to be looking for technological breakthroughs or implementation of these new technologies, I would expect to see them in places like South Korea or China or India before we ever start implementing them here. I was just in Tonga. Tonga has declared they're going to go 50% renewable by 2012. That was because the oil spike price of 2008 wrecked their economy. I said, we can't be held hostage to this anymore. So they're just going to deal with it.
So
likewise, by the way, in New Delhi, India, announced that they're going to be coal-free as well within 5 to 10 years. You know, switching over to another fossil fuel, natural gas, but at the same time, the idea they really want to get off the coal economy there.
And natural gas is about a quarter of the CO2 or something, isn't it?
I believe so.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what sort and how they're using it. But yeah, it's substantially lower.
But just to follow on my Cassandra trajectory here, my understanding is that we reach a tipping point, and that sort of Mother Nature has created this kind of trap for us. That if we pass a certain point, things get exponentially worse. And for example, as the permafrost melts that you were talking about, it releases enormous amounts of methane. Methane is I think, a worse global warming gas than even CO2. So that's my understanding, that unless we really go cold turkey very quickly, there's still a whole bunch of this stuff that hasn't got up there yet. And so we're way behind the curve. And so that really radical action is required. And that's where I wonder about this cognition thing. How do you get people to recognize the unbelievable gravity of this situation?
Well, you look for allies in important, influential sectors of the economy and government who will pay the price for things going wrong on their watch. So that's the military, that's intelligence, that's the insurance industry, that's city planners. You know, there are a lot of people who are paid to think long term. In many cases, they don't actually have very good access to science or good analysis of that science. It's a long, painstaking process. I'm talking about in the U.S. And again, in other countries, they tend to be much further ahead. But in the U.S., this seems to be the process. But you know, as with many issues in the U.S., like healthcare or education or the prison system, you know, you have a problem at the federal level, you know, and dealing with any of these large systemic problems. So my approach tends to be to work with those industries and also to work with people locally, because you can accomplish quite a bit locally. And if you accomplish something locally, you can have a proof of concept for scaling up. So if you're a city, I mean, Tonga is like 100,000 people, right? But if they do it, they can show that 100,000 people can do it. And then maybe 10 times 100,000 people will try to do it, or 100 times 100,000 people will do it. But I wouldn't look for direction from the top on this. You know, it is a quagmire in DC right now. And I'm using a polite term because, so, you know, but there is increasing understanding, at least in military and intelligence circles, about this issue, but largely in the context of energy. Now, you mentioned methane. The largest single industrial sector that produces greenhouse gases is the livestock industry, more so than the transportation industry.
And coal?
Coal is used in different, I mean, if you're talking about sectors, right? Nobody says, look, maybe don't eat meat every day. They say drive a Prius, right? I mean, without broadening the debate, right, you know, we won't get where we need to go. So we need to go back to the science and take a look at what's actually happening in terms of methane release, in terms of CO2 saturation in the ocean, in terms of what's actually anthropogenic greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, and start to deal with it that way.
So, Jeff, is it? I mean, in the coal area, it seems to be sort of Pavlovian. You have to have a terrible disaster, and then people start focusing on it, and then there's a lot of outrage and a lot of talk about improving things, and frankly, not a lot of progress. So my sense is that this is also a kind of metaphor for the broader issues that we're talking about. And the only problem I have with the idea that we're not going to wake up until we feel the pain is that when we feel the pain, it may be too late. Is that the pattern that you've observed from Appalachia?
But throughout the whole country, and that's why I began with the whole issue of black lung disease, the idea that we knew about it in 1831, but we denied it until a disaster in 1968 when we had a horrific mine accident in West Virginia, and Richard Nixon begrudgingly had to push through the workplace safety laws and the black lung laws. Up until 1968, you had medical doctors on the payroll of the coal companies saying that black lung would cure tuberculosis. And so that same mentality, in America, a crisis is never a crisis unless it's validated by disaster. And I think that's what we're waiting for, is this sort of disaster. And I think the quagmire that we're dealing with in Washington is not a quagmire, it's simply a brick wall of an incredible lobby that's been going on and has infiltrated both political parties. In the last 2 years, the big coal, which is talking about not only coal companies but the utility companies, have spent $128 million in lobbying Congress and the White House to water down any kind of control, for example, through the EPA and controlling emissions, both on mercury or even discussing CO2 limits, on watering down any other kind of thing dealing with the coal industry, with the coal ash, for example. It's amazing, a few months ago, after waiting for months, we were not able to get a legitimate coal ash regulation that actually categorizes coal ash as hazardous. Still today, it's not. You can eat coal ash, it's not hazardous. And so this is what we have to confront, is the reality of this massive coal lobby that is influential and now in the White House, that we have a president, who I love dearly. He's the first Democrat I ever voted for in my life. I didn't vote for any Republicans. Who's completely bought into the chimera of clean coal because of this coal lobby.
But I think it's even more pernicious because if you notice all the TV talk shows, the Sunday morning shows, Meet the Press and all those, and those PBS shows, Washington Week on Friday, CNN, all of their key shows, if you look at the ads, those are all, and the credits, they're all underwritten by the clean coal lobby.
Exactly.
So little wonder that the big pundits in this country aren't particularly anxious to take it on, because that's their bread and butter.
Exactly. And so in my home state, this week, we have a check for $1 billion coming to a tiny town called Meridosa. It was where they made little buttons, on the Illinois River, which in fact where Illinois coal was discovered in the 1600s. It was actually in Illinois. And they're getting $1 billion of welfare to create what we call NeverGen, or what they call FutureGen, where they're going to actually try to burn. They no longer can capture the carbon emissions and then compress them and pump them into the ground. They're going to try to burn it with oxygen and then pipe it 170 miles across the state, looking for holes they can compress it into. It's one of the biggest boondoggles. Think about it. $1 billion of welfare going to the industry. And FutureGen, who is FutureGen? If you look at their site, the Alliance, it's the largest coal companies and utilities in the world, both from China, from Peabody, of course, which turned an eightfold profit last year, to the Australian companies. It's an amazing situation that's going on right now. And this is really sort of the reality that we're in, that they're waiting for some sort of miracle to happen when they truly know that it's not going to happen. The FutureGen, for example, the idea that we can capture these carbon emissions is still in a stage that is so prohibitively expensive. We have no idea about leaks. We have no idea about the seismic areas. We're in between the Wabash seismic zone, of course, and the New Madrid seismic zone. They have no idea, and yet they're willing to invest billions upon billions to cater to the coal industry.
Cleo, you about to say something?
Going back to crises, but I've had colleagues in the Ministry of Defense in the UK and in Department of Energy here saying we're waiting for a good crisis to push these things forward. And the question is, how many crises do you need? Right? I mean, the crises, the thing about destabilization of the environment is it manifests in many different ways. So you get Katrina, you get the snowstorms in DC, you get the drought in the southeast, you get what's happening in Pakistan. But the dots aren't, you get the fires in Russia, but the dots aren't being connected. They're all treated as one-offs. And again, this has to do with this kind of the way that things are siloed extremely rigidly. I mean, the same thing about the economics of coal. Coal, as you saw with water, with nuclear, thermal plants are a water issue. And this is a country that's going to have very serious water issues. But the cost of water isn't factored into the production of energy. So unless you get a more realistic integrated economic analyses, you don't see your actual risks and vulnerabilities. And so your solutions are incomplete and actually quite dangerous. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that applies, doesn't it, to Canada's big hope is all those tar sands up in Alberta, and to wash the sand out, to get the tar out of the sand, requires an enormous amount of water, all of which gets polluted. And that water may end up being more valuable than the oil.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, water is, it produces energy, it produces agriculture, and it keeps urban areas alive, right? So it has multiple usages. If you use it for something like the oil sands, it's dead. It cannot be reused. So, but that cost isn't factored into the economic analyses of the oil sands. And in the same way, the cost of, the economic liability associated with the BP site, with the BP spill, when it was insured, was limited strictly sort of to the economic interest associated with the loss of oil and maybe the cleanup strictly of the spill, that sort of thing, but not the knock-on tourism effects, long-term environmental effects, loss of fisheries. These narrow bands of analyses are incredibly dangerous, and they're created in part through these very narrow lobbies that only look at their specific areas. But then that goes back to how government is funded and who you can take money from and why. So, if you want to start dealing with environmental change issues, you need to revisit that Supreme Court verdict of a few months ago saying that corporations can give directly to political parties, right?
Well,
specifically on that, Ian, the National Academy of Sciences came out last year with a study that the coal industry alone, there's an additional $62 billion a year in external costs that are never considered within the so-called cost of coal. And this is not even mentioning the human costs, the human rights violations and environmental costs, but $62 billion a year in healthcare costs. We have thousands upon thousands of abandoned mines that your tax dollars have to clean up, It's your tax dollars that cleaned up the TVA disaster. And then those kind of external costs are never factored in. Not to mention the human cost of coal.
Well, let's take questions here from our so look, we're raring to go here. Down in the front, second row, and somebody on the other side there too.
I attended one of the hearings that already happened with the LADWP, and I can tell you that what they're looking at is comparing the renewables with keeping the coal plants, and they're using the economics of what the coal costs now without factoring in any of the externalities of the cost of the coal. And the main point that I made at that meeting was that they should try and do a true cost accounting, and that's something that all of us can lobby for. And this is going to be a several-month process to get it through the board of the LADWP and then to the city council. And if we can really make that point that it's not the way that the report is right now is not a true cost comparison, that will help change it so that they get off the coal faster.
That's a great point. Think about it. This is what hit me on Highway 405 when I just couldn't believe the amount of traffic in front of me. I can't believe Ian would organize something during rush hour to come to meet up. Is that your coal fire use in LA, the emissions, is equivalent to 11 million cars every day, And once again, this is part of the externalities we're not talking about, the greater costs. It's a wonderful point.
Somebody on this side? This gentleman here in the third row.
Being a pessimist or a realist, let's assume that things continue the way they are for the next 10 years.
That's being a realist.
That's why I started that way. Nothing gets fixed. There is no leadership. We just continue on from one crisis to another, papering them over. Where would we be at that point?
I have a kayak I can loan you.
I think this country, assuming everything stays the way it is, will become increasingly isolated. It will become increasingly economically, socially, and politically fragile. And other countries that have longer, whether you like them or not, and whether they're good or not, longer term, more diverse approaches to the world, such as China, will be taking over positions that the U.S. had assumed it would have forever, for example, in Latin America. And that will affect international policy making. You saw it with Copenhagen, you saw it with the WTO, they were shut down by China and India. The US is increasingly finding it difficult to promote policies that it is counting on to keep its economy going. So you're going to start, I mean, there's already huge vulnerabilities within the US, and the policies that are currently in place are not equipped to reinforce those. And once you go down, it's much more difficult to go back up again.
Well, I understand, Cleo, that the casino capitalism that brought us the 2008 Wall Street meltdown and took the global economy to the brink of collapse, that the rest of the world is saying, we don't want anything to do with Wall Street now, because you saw what happened with the Greeks, that Goldman Sachs hid their debt and played games with them, with their sovereign debt. That kind of complicity. But I understand, for example, for decades, the Saudis have recycled all their petrodollars through Wall Street. They're not doing it anymore.
Yeah, there's a massive flight from the Western economic system. It's looking for other areas, but the financial crisis cost both China and the Middle East billions, and also a lot of the Russian oligarchs. You're starting to see that money move elsewhere. The trust is gone, and it's having very large impacts in other areas. So if Copenhagen, for example, the Copenhagen climate negotiations, the U.S. proposal, which was to create this kind of global climate financial mechanism, parts of it were literally drafted by the same person that created some of the credit default swap legislation. And the Chinese and Indians said, you think we're stupid? You just crashed our economy and you're trying to get us to sign on to another dodgy international deal? Now, it used to be that other countries, during the Cold War, you needed the umbrella of the US if you didn't want to fall under the Soviet sphere. And during the 90s, the countries were kind of rebuilding and redefining themselves. But now we're not the only game in town. So Tonga, for example, I was there before Copenhagen and asked them what their position would be at Copenhagen. And in a moment of unusual political honesty, the negotiator said, whatever China tells us it's going to be. We owe them $200 million. We're going to do what they say. And there was just a big meeting in Abu Dhabi between the Arab League and Pacific Island leaders, which issued a communique on Iran. This is like Tonga and Tuvalu declaring their position on Iran. Right?
And what was their position?
They weren't very fond of it. Because Arab League is Sunni dominated, right?
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So, but basically the point is you're starting to see new players coming in because the U.S. is not able to project power politically like it used to.
Right.
And that's going to increasingly decline unless something happens.
It's called the sorrows of empire. Gentleman here in the fourth row up. Could you put the mic up to you?
Yes, there are three problems that occur to me over and over again in this discussion. I think I'll just concentrate on one. It's kind of a philosophical or psychological problem that human beings tend to discount the future very steeply relative to the present, in fact, hyperbolically. We just don't seem to be evolutionarily adapted. We don't seem to be evolutionarily adapted to think and plan for the long term, because for most of our history on Earth, it wouldn't have meant anything anyway. And I don't see how to get around this thing. I will mention one other thing, more specifically American. It seems the Calvinist or Puritan background of this country makes it almost impossible for us to engage in collective problem-solving activities because of this individualistic bias we have. You always ask in your program why it is that Americans always vote against their interests. And it seems to me that's part of it. So, any comments on those two things?
The long-term thing is very important, and that's what the state is supposed to do for you. right? I mean, the state is supposed to be able to take a longer term view. And in many countries, it does. You look at China, they have 50, 100-year plans. I mean, that's what the one-child policy is, a plan, on a centuries scale. This country, because of its 2-year electoral cycle, has not particularly very long attention span. And it makes it very difficult for politicians to do something, to make a decision that would cost them now while they're in office, but would only pay off for the next guy. So I'm not advocating dictatorships, right? But I'm saying the structure of governance and also the awareness of the population of what the real issues are has a big effect on how long-term a decision can be. In India, which is a democracy, still has long-term planning, in large part because there is quite an active civil society that brings those sorts of concerns to the table. They're also in the process of development. When you're in the process of development, you have to have a longer-term view. We have what we call developed country complacency syndrome. You figure you're developed and it's fine and get just a little tweak here and there. But many other countries that are in the process of developing are putting in infrastructure for the first time. They have to think in 10, 20, 30, 50, 100-year timelines. So you're starting, and I can see it very clearly in my field, there is a growing gap between the way the developing world is approaching these problems and the developed world is approaching these problems. At a state level. At an individual level, I agree with you, obviously. Yeah.
And Jeff, do you have a comment on the idea? I know it's that, what's the matter with Kansas idea? Why people vote against their interests? I mean, I'm always, because I'm from Australia, people always say, well, you're descended from convicts. And to which I say, well, you're descended from religious fanatics,
I'm a Swede, so.
That's true. The Australians are just as bad as the US on Kyoto.
I think, to me, a lot of my life's work, and recently in these past several years, working specifically on our coal and energy policy, has been to debunk a lot of mythology that, in fact, allows us to feel as if we are going to be okay for the long term. We have a president who still speaks as if we live in the Saudi Arabia of coal, for example. And he continues to go around the country saying we have a 200 to 250 year supply of coal, which in fact is not true. Just like we are not only reaching an issue of peak oil, we're also eventually going to be reaching an issue of peak coal. We have less than 20 years left in our Appalachian coal basin. We have, for example, 40% of our coal comes from the Powder River Basin in Wyoming, and there we feel like we have anywhere from 10 to 12 years of coal that's going to be accessible, that otherwise then we get into the dirty and very costly coal. And I think that's part of the problem that we have in the United States is these mythologies that have allowed us to let the engines of industry and commerce run things because everyone assumes everything's going to be okay as long as we can flick on our lights, for example, not having a clue where our electricity is coming from. I mean, how many people in LA really know 44% of your electricity comes from coal? I'm sure if you walk out on the street today, no one knows that. And so that kind of lack of knowledge, lack of engagement, literally we're not plugged in to the cause and effect of our own actions, our own consumption, I think is part of this mythology of allowing us not to have this long-term perspective.
The lady in the middle here, well, no, wait a second. We're going to get a microphone. It'll come along to you, and we all want to hear.
What's the reality of wind farms? I haven't read anything about it in the near past.
Right. It really comes down to funding. You know, there's more people working in the wind industry than in the coal industry now. There's 80,000 people who work in the coal industry, more or less, and about 81,000. Of course, this doesn't include a lot of external employees that have worked in various industries, so it's not a fair comparison. But wind, of course, is booming, and also solar. There's this whole smorgasbord. You know, we never can say wind is going to replace coal. Solar is going to replace coal. No, we really have to look at a whole smorgasbord of alternatives like we've talked before. I think there's been many studies that we don't need to quote that said if America simply had a true energy efficiency policy, to really retrofit our homes, to rebuild our buildings that are much more efficient in terms of our energy use, we could cut consumption by 20% to 30% like that. You know, we simply don't even need to put up a solar panel or put up a windmill. But I think, like I said, last year, with very few funds from the stimulus fund during one of the worst recessions, we increased wind by 39%. You know, Secretary Salazar, you know, talks about offshore wind. You know, and look at all these kind of oil rigs we have down there in the Gulf, all these abandoned oil rigs which could be set up with windmills and turbines. You know, last week, Stanford, of course, that you all love here in Los Angeles, Stanford had amazing breakthrough with solar energy, looking at both containing light and heat and really accelerating. You know, I think that's the excitement I have, and in fact, I'm not a pessimist because we can't be a pessimist. I have children, and that I feel like we have to look at the future as a way in which we are going to be able to work it out, because every day we do have these breakthroughs. And until we have this vision that we're going to live in a coal-free or fossil fuel-free society, I think we're going to live in this almost nihilistic way. And we have to be optimistic.
There is that NIMBY factor, though, with wind, because the Kennedys tried to stop the wind farm in Nantucket, and there's a wonderful British documentary of a guy who tries to set up a wind farm in an abandoned World War II airfield, and the local people all vote it down because they think aesthetically it's going to be unpleasant.
Right.
But at the same time, they're all saying that we're all environmentalists.
Right.
They couldn't make that connection.
I can give you an example of the battle between wind and coal. You might have read about it in the New York Times last week. Coal River Mountain, which is the last standing range there in the Coal River Valley of West Virginia. It's ground zero of mountaintop removal movement. An amazing young man came in and realized instead of strip mining this last intact mountain, which only has 14 years of coal reserves that they can use, which would only produce about 100 jobs, that would completely destroy the historic communities below. And it'll be blasting within 2 whoops and a holler of a 2.8 billion gallon, the largest coal slurry impoundment in the world, in the hemisphere, which is up in the hills that was being held back by an earthen dam that is totally underneath honeycombed old coal mines. And they're blasting near this thing that if it broke, would go and destroy all these villages nearby. 1,000 people would have less than 15 minutes to flee if the coal slurry impoundment. This young man goes to Coal River Mountain a few years ago and realizes they have one of the best wind potentials. You know, there's different levels of wind potential. You simply can't just put up a windmill and hope for wind. And he did a study, and then they had other studies that came in that instead of this horrible strip mine, this mountaintop removal operation, that if they put in a certain amount of windmills, they could create enough electricity for 150,000 households, more tax revenues than the coal, and they would create more jobs over a 20-year period, and they would be able to keep the community intact. You know, and I think this is what we're doing now in the front lines of the coal communities, is saying we have to take it upon us to find the alternative. Even though this kind of coal mining is an absolute human rights violation, it's a crime that should be stopped. We are coming up with the solutions ourselves to counter the coal industry.
Down here in the third row. There you go.
The only thing that gives me any kind of hope is I teach elementary school, and they're so much smarter than any adult I've ever met. John Dewey said it in the 1920s, government is the shadow that business throws over the people. I don't think we have a government. I think that we have a bunch of bureaucrats that are funneling our money into the pockets of business. I don't think the government exists. I think that business, and that's probably what makes us different from even, I don't want to be in a dictatorship, but I think that separates us. I say one ungrammatical thing to my kids: nothing happens for no good reason. The reason why things aren't changing is that money is trying to stay where it is. And it's not going to change until, as I try to teach my kids, we're a learning community. And until that happens, I'm unbelievably pessimistic, realistic, and hope the I just tell the kids, grow up fast and remember how beautiful your hearts are.
Hey, but you remember this old man who would be wonderful on the stage, and he had his cigar and his whiskey, and old Studs Terkel reminded us at the age of 95, hope dies last. And you have to believe that, just for your kids, if that. Hope has to die last.
I think it's very astute that the money is trying to preserve itself. The thing that's new is that the current systems don't work, and if you actually do care, even if you're kind of the fat cat Wall Street guy. He wasn't so fat in 2008, 2009, right? These systems don't work. So I actually do a lot of consulting in industry to say, look, you think you're going to make money. You're not. You have to change your systems for your own self-preservation. We are all in this together. The financial collapse was the first collapse, but it won't be the last collapse. So if you want to continue to make yourself stable, I mean, the Koch brothers are a good example. They're doing, they're funding the climate denier lobby because they think it's going to affect their business. Well, what's going to affect their business is the climate, right? It's going to knock out their refineries. It's going to knock out their ability to transport, their pipelines, their forestry operations. It's all of it. So sort of making people who are in the position that you're talking about, I mean, I don't actually see it changing that much either. But if they understand what they're risking and how this does not benefit them, then perhaps you can get a sort of unholy alliance. No, that's right. Yeah, me and my dog will go up to Capitol Hill and do our demonstrations on good science. Then I think we can actually possibly get somewhere. God
Lady
willing.
down in the front here. And then we'll do this side, I'm sorry.
Well, we thank you for your very noble cause, which actually gives a lot of credit to both your home countries. But how are you dealing with countries such as China and India who've said they're not coming on board in any of this because they are developing countries?
Can I take that? What they're not coming on board with is a carbon trading policy that was largely designed in Copenhagen to be a new set of financial mechanisms that could have been used from looking at it from the Indian and China perspective to create essentially green tariffs to block entry into Western markets. And that would also open up their industries to potential industrial espionage under the guise of verification of carbon emissions. So what they did not agree to was something that any country that would be defending its economic interests could not agree to. However, at the same time, if you look at countries like India and China, they are desperately trying to put in place renewable energies, if only for energy security reasons. And they're also trying to set up domestic carbon trading regimes, if only for the sake of their own financial sectors, which want to make money off of carbon trading. It is. It's also building solar plants. It needs the energy. It's not going to stop. And this becomes a question of. There's very emotive language around this. The developing countries also say they're owed reparations based on the damage done to them environmentally because the West had 150 years of unbridled carbon emissions. Yeah. So it's. That's why what I look at largely is adaptation, because we're going to have to adapt. So while other valiant folk work in the area of mitigation, we should also be ramping up adaptation at the same time.
Over on this side. Gentlemen,
this week in the California State Senate, our legislators are debating a bill or considering a bill on banning single-use plastic bags in California stores. And while it's great that they're doing this and hopefully it will pass, nobody is forcing people to use single-use plastic bags. We could have been bringing our own bags for many years. And I think a lot of things that are being discussed, people have to take responsibilities themselves, and in addition to expecting the government to do something for them. Meat eating was one of the items was mentioned briefly on the stage. We can all cut way back on the amount of meat we consume, and yet very, very few Americans are willing to do that. If you're driving your Prius on the highway at a reasonable rate of speed, maybe not on the 405 in rush hour, but sometimes in this area and certainly out in non-urban areas, that if you're driving a Prius at 60 or 65 miles an hour, you're getting 5 times or 5 to 10 times as many miles per gallon as some guy who's driving by in an SUV or a pickup truck going 80 miles an hour. The ratios are miles per gallon of going at a reasonable speed in a Prius and an unreasonable speed in an SUV are just enormous. These are the kind of things we can be doing ourselves, and yet so few people actually think about these things when they're carrying out their everyday existence.
I think that's a very, very, very good point. You know, I've been in 25 states this past year, and I think that's why I remain very optimistic. In New York City, for example, when you go down to pay your electrical bill, you can choose, you can click whether you want clean energy or a fossil fuel. And in fact, people are not aware of this program, but in fact, it exists in many different states. Even in Chicago, you're able to select where you want your fuel, where you want your utility to be buying it from. I think there is, unfortunately, a mentality that we have to get leadership out of Washington. And obviously, we do need to have Washington to regulate, for example, the coal industry. But at the same time, this very decentralized movement for example, in the South, and in Appalachia, where I do a lot of my work, probably the most exciting citizen movement today is with food. And the slow movement and the farms to the school movement and the organic food movement that really is connected to reducing the consumption of meat and whatnot. And so I think, to me, you're making a huge point, is that local efforts are really perhaps going to be, like, for example, like LA declaring itself coal-free, are really going to be the trigger that's going to make Washington finally act when they see it happening in the rest of the parts of the country.
Over to hear this gentleman in the middle here.
Thank you, and good evening. I'd just like to know your perspective, especially Canadian, looking into the United States, right? Who's dropping the ball? Where you've got the EPA, you've got the Department of Interior, especially with the strip mines and just the whole mining industry. So who is it that is really neglecting? I mean, of course, grassroots, we've got the potential to make a difference, but who, in terms of the regulatory system, is really dropping the ball and just kind of letting the corporations, letting the private sector have free reign?
Everybody? Yeah.
Yeah.
I
I think specifically, for example, in mining, the labyrinth of regulations. You know, we passed, there was a liberal Democrat. You know, it's always the liberal Democrats who are screwing up. It's a liberal Democrat who got elected in 1976 to stop strip mining. And of course, when Jimmy Carter then was elected, we tried to pass an anti-strip mining bill, and the Congress, because of the big coal lobby, passed a watered-down Surface Mine Reclamation Control Act. And the same mentality functions today, is that you can regulate these abominations. You can regulate an outlaw industry, you know? And I think that's what we're finding now, is you have this labyrinth of agencies. For example, in the mining industry, you have, just like you pointed out, the EPA, the Department of Interior, Office of Surface Mines and Reclamation, the Council of Environmental Quality, the White House role. Then you have the Congress coming in with it's a mess. And so everyone's able to say it's his job, it's her job, it's his job, it's her job. And these kind of regulations are being dropped right now, specifically within the mountaintop removal situation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be facetious about saying it part of it is systemic, where the momentum, as was mentioned before, is for the status quo. So very few people want to stick their necks out within their organizations to try to get something different, to try to change it. That's where outside lobbies can actually be very helpful, particularly outside industrial lobbies. I think the insurance industry, which is taking a huge loss on this, but will likely be bailed out by the government. If the government doesn't want to have to bail them out, could use the insurance lobby to help push for legislation and regulations and enforcement of existing regulations, because they're very good existing regulations that aren't being enforced, in order to try to make things a little bit more secure. But the momentum for maintaining the status quo, and at a very basic level, making sure you don't get fired or shifted down to an office in the basement, is a pretty strong motivation, unfortunately.
By the way, just in terms of the regulatory overlaps or lack of them, in the government. I learned today that apropos of this egg crisis with salmonella from the farm in Iowa, the Department of Agriculture is in charge of the chicken, and the FDA is in charge of the egg. So
which one comes
first?
first?
At least we know which comes first.
But
Not the health of
one
the
thing
American public.
I did want to add, though, it's like, it's easy to beat up on our president right now. And I'm probably part of many people who's profoundly disappointed with a lot of things that's happened in Washington when we expected something different. But at the same time, he did inherit 8 years of virtual lawlessness in terms of a lot of the regulatory agencies. For example, specifically in my sector, so many coal company executives were put into the government in key positions and completely gutted. The Mine Safety Health Administration was gutted. 18% of the employees cut, you know, and you no longer had people going into the mines for workplace safety, but you had compliance officers, no longer people doing inspections. And so I think that's what we're still recovering. You know, Obama has only been in office for 2 years, and we had 8 years of, for example, in the coal industry itself, virtual, no holds bar, no regulation whatsoever, and I think that's what we're still recovering from.
Gentleman down here in front.
We're doomed. You know, I have to echo the gentleman's comments. I listen to your program frequently, and I always wonder, why do you ask the question? Why are people voting against their economic self-interest?
Because I'm looking for an answer.
Well, but we know what the answer is, which is that basically people are greedy and selfish, and so.
But they're not getting anything out of it.
But they perceive that they do, and one of the strong indicators of that, I think, is the way our government is now tied into a knot by a very small political segment. Tea Party, radical Republicans, you know, global capital, and so people think that it's like you spent time in New Mexico. I'm from New Mexico. I think it's a beautiful place, but it's very sad because I think people are fighting over crumbs instead of working together to expand the pie there. And so, of course, the Diné, they want to get in on the game. They want to open up their land to mineral extraction if they have to. So my concern is, is it too late? It just seems to me it's just there's not enough time, because even at grassroots level, someone says government makes business opportunity. Voters don't own the government in this country any longer. Even if the people that you consult with, I'm speaking to Camille, pardon me if I've got your name wrong, you try to
Cleo.
talk to them and tell them that they may suffer ultimate loss if they don't change the way they do business. The reason they got where they are is they probably think, well, I'm smarter than everybody else. There's a business opportunity here. I can co-opt this segment of the government. I can still make some more money, and it's not my problem. So that's why I said we're doomed.
The ones that will survive economically get it once it's sort of explained to them, and one of the ways that they have gotten where they are is by adapting to quickly changing environments, and they haven't been looking in this area. So if, for example, you're using renewable energies as for powering your industrial base, when the price of a barrel goes up to 140 next time, and it will, you'll be insulated from that shock, and your products will be, your price will be stable, whereas your competitors will have to absorb that cost or pass it on to the consumer. It's very basic economics. So the sorts of things that we're talking about doing for sound environmental reasons are just smart. I mean, they're not only smart, they're essential if you're going to survive politically, economically, specifically, or you know, as communities, whatever. I mean, everybody wins. It's a very unusual situation, especially in the US, where everything is, as you said at the beginning, sort of binary normally. Now, this is going renewable. You know, everybody wins except the people who are currently selling energy, right? So if everybody else who would win comes together and presents their case, whether it's economic or whether it's social or whether it's environmental, it becomes very strong. And these kind of grassroots or local movements they're proving it. You know, if Tonga goes renewable which it looks like it will, it's going to be in a better economic position than Australia during the next oil price, although they'll go to coal, actually, is probably what they'll do. But compared to other countries that are still running off 100% diesel. So when the crunch comes increasingly, and it will, the people that have prepared will be in a much better position and will have a bigger competitive economic advantage.
Let's take one last question here. This gentleman here, down in the second row.
Yes, since we do all operate in our own self-interest, did you talk anything, I came in a little late, but did you talk about the May 2010 Union of Concerned Scientists report about burning coal is like burning cash, where there's only a few producers of coal, but there's like 10 states that are spending over $1 billion a year buying coal from those producers. And if we look at just those dynamics within our country, there's a solution there if we could utilize those dollars that were now being wasted on and from those economies. And same thing we're talking about here in California is we're not even one of those. I don't believe I think Georgia is one of the top spenders.
Right, exactly. I mean, 40% of our coal, for example, comes from the Powder River Basin in Wyoming. And that's one of the things we often talk about Appalachia because the absolute horror, nightmare, environmental violation of mountaintop removal where they've destroyed so many mountains, over 500 mountains. But in fact, the lion's share of our coal does in fact come from the West. But I think you've touched on a very important point is where are we going to put these dollars of investment now? And I think we are seeing a breakthrough with the administration that billions of dollars are going to be going into renewable energy. Billions of dollars are going to be going into energy efficiency programs and green jobs. Billions of dollars are going to be going into all sorts of local investments for wind and solar and whatnot. And I think the battle now is to really confront and call them out on wasting our money on coal. I still feel like it comes down to a basic issue of what George Bush called the vision thing. That as long as we operate on the assumption that, well, we're gonna need it anyway, we're not gonna be able to get off it. And this is where Al Gore, to me, has been very prophetic, is that he's basically saying within 10 years, we can get off fossil fuels. We can do it, America. We can figure it out. And even Secretary of Energy Chu basically says, hey, we have to have a revolutionary way of thinking now. We have to get beyond this kind of box thinking that we can only do X, Y, and Z or go back to nukes or something. And I think to me, it is the vision thing that we're lacking right now, of people saying, we can have a coal-free future. We can have a fossil-free future. We can have a nuclear power-free future. We can stop and stabilize the climate destabilization that's going now if we act now. And I think it really comes down to the will, but more importantly, truly leaders who have this kind of vision.
A last word from our Pacific Islander Canadian.
Yeah, leaders and people. I mean, everybody in this room, you can do it. You look around you, and whether it's going to be related to food or whether it's going to be related to water or whether it's going to be related to carbon, whatever it is, professionally or personally, take a look and see how you will be affected by the coming changes and what you can do to create more resilience for yourself if you are operating along the self-interest principle. If only out of your own self-interest, do an assessment. California is one of the most vulnerable states in the country in terms of coastal erosion, sea level rise, saltwater infiltration to groundwater, unstable water, agricultural problems. You've got a lot of issues here, right? And pick the one that you like. Pick the one that feels right for you and do it, or guilt your partner into doing it, or whatever. But it's not going to necessarily come from the top. But we can do it. We have to do it, and I think we will do it.
Well, I thank both our Pacific Islander Canadian and our mountain man from Appalachia for coming here, and let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.